Keyframes, kind of a strange word, but pretty simple stuff really. So let's dive in. Okay, keyframes can be thought of as little helpers that automate tasks on our production timelines. Whether it's an Adobe Audition for mixing audio, Premiere Pro for editing video, or After Effects for automating things like scaling up a shape, moving it left, then right, and so on. And once you get used to using keyframes, your life will be much easier. So let's head into Adobe Audition, and I'll show you a few examples of how keyframes can do a lot of the heavy lifting for you during the editing and mixing process. In Audition, there are areas typically known as automation lanes, and this is where we place keyframes to tell Audition what we want it to automate over time. So let's use volume as an example. Here I have a bit of audio on a track, and to get to the automation lane when I'm in multi-track view, you would click this arrow at the bottom left of the track, and that will drop down the automation lane. Now, before we get into inserting keyframes on the timeline, I'll explain a couple of things before I move on, like this Show Envelopes option right here. In here, you can tell Audition which feature you want to automate. And when you make a selection, an automation line appears on the right. In this case, I chose to automate volume, and you can see that Audition has given me a yellow line to work with. And that line is where I will insert keyframes to tell Audition what to automate and when. Let me show you what I mean. I'll move the playhead to this part of the timeline, and now I'll click on the yellow line inside the automation lane, and a keyframe appears. At this point, I can move the keyframe up or down to increase or decrease volume over time. And as you can see, I've chosen to fade the volume over time by X amount, and notice that you can see the values changing as I move the keyframe up and down. So by moving this keyframe down and stretching it out, I'm telling Audition I want it to lower the volume of this track by X amount over this period of time. So I'll move my playhead back, hit play, and let's watch what happens. You can see in the meter below that Adobe decreased the volume as it moved along the timeline. Okay, so let's also take a quick look at panning the channel left and right as another example. As you see here, when I choose panning as the option, a sort of bluish gray line appears. So if I insert keyframes here, I would be telling Audition to pan the audio to the left speaker over this period of time, and then by inserting another keyframe, I can tell it to hold it in that place for a certain period of time. And then by inserting another keyframe, I can tell it to pan the audio to the right side over that period of time, and so on. And by the way, you can get really granular with automation when the options are available, like changing values in EQ over time, compression settings, special effects, and so on. So needless to say, keyframes pack a lot of punch, and you can use them to automate a lot of things that would otherwise take up a ton of time if you had to do it all manually. So the lesson here is if you learn to use keyframes in your productions, they will have a significant impact on creating superior content. Okay, so let's move over to After Effects and take a look at some of the cool things we can do in there with keyframes. I've got a simple circle I drew on the screen here, and we'll get into how to do that some other time, but much like Audition, we have a timeline right here, but instead of audio being in that timeline, we have a visual content layer instead, and this layer is the container for this circle, and its length represents how long the circle will be on the screen. It's really no different than a waveform file in multi-track sessions in Audition, but instead of seeing a waveform in the track, you see a solid bar. And that's just how After Effects works, but I'm sure you get the idea. So I'm going to drop down the properties for this circle, and don't get too distracted by what I did there or the options that you see for this layer, because we'll get into how all of that works at a later time, and it will be easy enough to understand when I roll it out. For now, I'll just get to some keyframe automation inside After Effects so you can see some of the things that can be done to keyframe graphic elements. Okay, so what I'll do is start with my playhead at the beginning of the timeline, and I'll insert some keyframes to change the circle's position on the screen over time. In After Effects, keyframes are enabled by clicking the stopwatch next to any given property. Again, more on that later, but I wanted you to know what I'm doing as I move along so you can see how differing programs have unique ways of entering their keyframe data. Okay, so I'll tell After Effects to insert a keyframe here, and I'm going to reposition the circle by changing the X and Y values, which I can do directly at the property control, or I can click on the object itself and move it around, and those property controls will change according to where I place the object, as you can see here. So now I'm going to move the playhead forward, reposition the circle, and notice that After Effects recognizes that I made a change, and it took care of inserting a keyframe for me. With After Effects, that holds true for just about anything you do with keyframes. It just does a really good job of helping you out along the way. And as long as the stopwatch is activated, it will implement whatever actions you've assigned to any given object on the screen via the keyframes. And by the way, we're only scratching the surface of what can be done in After Effects, because this thing is an absolute beast when it comes to special effects. And you've seen it used many times across any given type of media, from commercials to web animations, blockbuster movies, and so on. So with that said, let's take a look at what After Effects does with the position data that I inserted into the keyframes. Here we go. As you can see, it's not at all difficult, and After Effects can be amazingly powerful if you dig into it and take the time to learn a little bit about it. It's not hard. It just looks like the control panel comes from a spaceship, right? But when you focus on one area at a time, like we did here, it's actually not that difficult to start creating some pretty cool stuff. Okay, so let's move over to Premiere and take a look at some of the things we can do in there to keyframe some video elements. Premiere is somewhat similar to After Effects, but it's kind of a dumbed down version, if you will. Now, you can edit video in After Effects, and many people do, especially when it comes to projects where you know you're going to be incorporating special effects or graphics and whatnot. But in Premiere, the main focus is on just editing video, even though Premiere has gained a bit of special effects functionality over the years, which is handy when you're just looking to add a little something like title animations and whatnot. But the primary function is basic editing. But more on that some other time. Let's take a look at where and how we access keyframes in Premiere. Again, make sure you narrow your focus and don't get too distracted by all the options on the screen. We're just focusing on the effects control panel. And if you don't see that panel, you can go up to the window menu, drop down until you see it, and then select it. And if yours isn't in the same area as mine, don't worry about it, because these panels can be clicked to drag and drop them just about anywhere that makes sense to you. Okay, so I'm going to click on a video asset, this clip right here, and the effects control panel will give me access to create some keyframes for that clip. So like we did with After Effects, I'll move my playhead back in the timeline and click on the stopwatch to activate any given control that I'm looking to keyframe. And in this case, I'm going to go for scaling up this clip by moving it forward, and then I'll increase the scale. Okay, so I'll play that so you can see what that looks like. Okay, so let's try a fade. I'll click on the stopwatch for opacity, which drops in a keyframe, and you can see that over here on the right. And now I'll move the playhead forward, drop the opacity to 0, and play that back. Okay, so pretty simple stuff, right? It's really just a matter of how deep you want to dive into things. And a lot of what you can create is pretty much only limited by your imagination. So maybe try some keyframing yourself, and if you're up for it, share the results. This is all in preparation for some things that will be rolled out for Premiere Pro, After Effects, so on and so forth. And keyframing is a very large and important part of that. So now that you're up to speed on this, it should be that much easier to take in what's coming. All right, guys, I'll see you next round.